Hello and welcome to the Beach House 34 podcast. I'm your host, Christine Worth. Welcome to the new subscribers and welcome back to all of our loyal listeners. If you're here, you know that I've covered the Darlie Routier Trial transcripts from the very beginning, and the final testimony is over, and we're now into closing statements. In this episode, we're still hearing from the defense, and we start with Mr. Mulder, and Mr. Mosty wraps it up. And in the next episode, we'll hear the final statement from the prosecution. So let's get on with the statement from Mr. Mulder. And at this point, the jury has been brought back into the courtroom, and the court says, let the record reflect that all parties in the trial are present and the jury is seated. Mr. Mulder, you have 42 minutes. Mr. Mulder says, yes, sir. Thank you, Your Honor. May it please the court? The court says, yes, sir. And Mr. Mulder says, once again, I have an opportunity to speak directly to you. And I think it would indeed be thoughtless of me not to take a moment or two to thank you for the time and attention that you have all devoted to this case. This has been a relatively long case, as cases go, and I'm sure that y'all have things you would rather be doing. We have taken you away from your homes and from your families and from your jobs, and we appreciate it deeply. Last night, when I visited with Darlie, and I asked her, is there anything in particular that you would like to have me say to this jury? Mr. Greg Davis of the prosecution says, I'm going to object to that as being outside the record as to what he did last night. And the court says both sides are instructed to stay within the record, and the jury is instructed to remember the testimony as they heard it, and you may continue. Mr. Mulder continues. She just asked that I thank you, and I do that. Mr. Greg Davis says, I'm going to object to that again about whatever conversations that he may have had outside of this courtroom. And the court says, well, I'll sustain the objection, and let's stay within the record, please. Mr. Mulder continues. Yes, sir. I need to visit with you a little bit about some of the very fundamental principles of law. And then I, too, would like to share my thoughts with you in an effort to help you, if it does, in arriving at your verdict. But let me make one thing clear. You aren't down here to return a verdict that is going to make me happy. And you aren't down here to return a verdict that is going to make Greg Davis happy. The only people that have to be satisfied and happy with your verdict are the 12 of you. Now, the law says, and we talked to you about this on voir dire, the law says that all people are presumed to be innocent. And the law says that that presumption stays with them until the state proves their guilt beyond all reasonable doubt. Another way of saying, whoever does the accusing has to do the proving. Now, way back 4 weeks ago, Mr. Davis stood before you, and for a half an hour or 40 minutes, he told you, he made a pledge, he made a promise, and he said, we're going to prove that Darlie Routier is self-centered and materialistic, and that she and her husband were in financial straits, and that it was just too expensive to maintain these youngsters. And that is why she killed them. Now, isn't that basically what he said? Now let's talk about finances for a minute. We know that she and Darren had their own business. And we know that through June of 1996, they had taken in approximately $86,000 in cash in that business. We know their expenses were some $5,000 a month in that business, and that leaves us some $56,000. Mr. Davis said, oh, but you were $10,000 in debt to the IRS. He says, I always owe the IRS. And he said, you owed your credit card companies some $12,000. You know, I had expected from the statement that he made that he was going to bring bankers down here, and he was going to bring mortgage people down here, and he was going to bring people from the credit card companies talking about how they were hounding these folks, and he was going to bring car repossessors and things of that nature to show how he had lost his business and they were almost to be thrown out in the street. But that is not what happened. 86,000 in 6 months. Expenses of some 30,000, that is 56,000. And that may not be high cotton to Mr. Davis, but it's better than 9,000 disposable income that he had each month. But he said in addition to that, he said there was 18 or 20,000 that I had in accounts receivable that I have since brought in. So it was there and available if I wanted it. And he had $7,900 in the bank, and he showed $64 in their personal checking account. Who cares? Like I said, that's a long way from Skid Row. Those are not dire straits to my way of thinking. Now, you have had some false impressions and I was a little surprised, but for example, you will recall from that den, they brought you some records. Mr. Davis introduced through Maine records about someone contemplating the disposal of their assets in the event of death. And the idea or the impression that he wanted to leave was that there was death thoughts in the mind of Darlie Routier on the night of June the 5th. Y'all recall that? But the thing he didn't bring you was the fact that they had a letter from the lawyer dated September of 1995 talking about estate planning. And all of this was in the same file. And that was intended to deceive you, because it wasn't until we had a chance at bat that we were able to straighten that out. But there was no death contemplated by her. That was strictly done to mislead you. Now, I think there were some leads out there that perhaps they should have pursued. You will recall when Jimmy Patterson was on the witness stand and I had to call him. Can you believe that the lead detective, the man who made the ultimate decision to charge Darlie, was not called by the state? They didn't call Patterson and they didn't call Frosch. I had to call them, and I was able to question him up until he took the fifth. And you will recall when the judge admonished him, but he tells you several things. Patterson told you that the very morning of this tragedy, they had a call at the police station, and the caller described a man who had a black cap. Mr. Davis says, "I'm sorry, that is a misstatement. It was not that morning. It was that afternoon on the 6th. The court says the jury is instructed to remember the testimony as they heard it and be guided by the charge of the court." Mr. Mulder continued, "I thought that Mr. Patterson said it was that morning, but I'll stand corrected. That afternoon is just as good." But they had a man that fit the same description that Darlie Routier had given, and he didn't bother to check it out because he said it was on the other side of town, which means that is 5 minutes away. He didn't bother to check it out because it was on the other side of town, and the man that called in had had the presence of mind to get the man's name. And to this date, they still haven't checked his fingerprints, if they have got them, with the fingerprints in that window. They haven't checked the fingerprints of Glenn Mize with the fingerprints in that window. And they haven't checked the fingerprints of Gary Austin, the fellow who lives down that alley that she wrote about in the letters that the investigators had told her about. And those were investigators that were in it before I was. But they still haven't checked their fingerprints with the fingerprints in the window. Now, what about the black car? Mr. Patterson knew about that black car because he was there and interviewed Nelda Watts, the neighbor who lived right here. And she told Mr. Patterson that there was a car that was parked out in front of her mailbox that morning. You see, they didn't call her because she contradicts what Gorsuch says. But we know by now from what the police officer said and everything else that Gorsuch he is not lying. He is simply mistaken about the facts. But we know that there were more cars out there than what Mr. Gorsuch led you to believe. But at any rate, she told you, and Patterson told you, that he was told that there was a black car that was parked out there, and that black car was seen when a scream was heard and a lady looked out of her window. She saw the black car there. Then, when the emergency vehicles arrived, that black car was gone. Now, Karen Neal also told you that she was there and she heard this next door neighbor of hers relate the facts to Patterson about the black car that was there when this scream was heard. And then later, when the emergency vehicles arrived, the black car was gone. And she told you that she had seen a black car in that vicinity some 7 or 8 days earlier. And she told you when she was coming home from work, remember, about 3 o'clock, and she saw the car parked there and thought it was unusual because it was parked there in the position where it could surveil the Routier house. She said she saw the car and it was suspicious to her, and she got out of her car to walk around and find out what the man was up to. And she said before she could ask, he drove away at a fast speed. And she said she told the police about that, told Patterson about that, but they didn't do anything about it. And she told you that later on, the day of the murders, she again saw that black car as it went through. Remember when it went through the neighborhood and she ran out and she didn't get the license number, but she told the police that this is the car that I was talking about. But they turned a deaf ear. The court says, 30 minutes left, Mr. Mulder. Mr. Mulder says 30. The court says 30. Mr. Mulder says, yes, sir. Folks, this was a normal family. You had a mom and dad, and you had a house and a picket fence, a rose garden. You had 3 children. You know, she just doesn't all of a sudden, out of the blue, go haywire and her children. Now, Mr. Davis has told us that he would bring witnesses. The state has the burden of proof. They have done the accusing. They have got to do the proving. They have brought you absolutely, and think about this. Who of us could withstand the scrutiny that they have put this woman under for the last 9 months? Unlimited funds to investigate her. They have got some 200 lawyers in the district attorney's office in Dallas. Some 100 and how many investigators? I don't know. They have got the Rowlett Police Department at their disposal. They have had them down here for weeks. Unlimited funds to investigate Darlie Routier. And they can't come up with one single witness that will say anything bad about her as a mother. The undeniable proof is that she is a very loving, very caring, very devoted mother. And don't you know, with unlimited funds, if that weren't true, they would have somebody down here saying something about it to the contrary. Don't you know, if she had ever mistreated those children, that someone would come down here under oath telling you about it? Let's talk for a little bit about that crime scene. And there is nothing magical about a crime scene. You know, this fellow from the FBI that came in here, Mr. Brantley, he learned a lot of what he is telling you about by talking to prisoners in the West Virginia Penitentiary. And you can imagine how truthful those folks are going to be with him. But that is where he got a lot of that and what he gleaned from that one murder investigation that he was involved in. But he came down here and he said, well, you know, after looking at everything, he said, I think it's someone who knew the boys very, very well. And he went through his risks and he went through the other things. But you know, when I asked him, and I would suggest to you that they have a duty and responsibility to tell you how this happened, okay? And if they can't tell you how it happened, then they have the duty and the responsibility to tell you why they can't tell you how it happened. But I said, Professor, Mr. Brantley, you are the analyst. Will you tell the jury, please, how this happened? And he said, well, I can't do that. Well, I mean, you are the analyst. You ought to be able to tell them how it happened. Who was first? How many knives? Well, I can't do it. Well, can you tell us how long it took to commit this particular? And that is going to be important on down the line. Think about that now. I want you to remember that, how long this took to commit this and stage, this thing. He said, I can't do that. All right, let's talk for a minute about staging. Cron, ex-deputy sheriff Cron, was called to the scene. And Jim Cron, he is a fine man. He worked at the sheriff's office many, many years. He was a fingerprint man. He left the sheriff's office about 3 years ago, grew a beard, and now he calls himself a consultant. And I don't quarrel with that, but he is a fingerprint man. But at any rate, he doesn't know any more about logic and common sense and what is reasonable and what isn't than you all do. Cron is the one, he gets out there and he says, look, he said, you couldn't go through that window without disturbing the dust on it. He said it was like a field of fresh fallen snow. Remember that? And then here comes Frosh right before his very eyes, and he goes in and out of it. Frosh, who is 6'3" and probably would dress out at about 220, goes through it back and forth 3 times and never disturbs it at all. I thought he was going to come out of here with that screen around his neck, but he went through that in and out before your very eyes 3 times. Well, Cron says, I guess he wants the lights turned out and the blinds, he said he didn't do it at night. I don't care what is, if it doesn't fit with his ideas and his opinion, then he just disregards it. And another thing that astounded me and must have you, he put his hand in the very same place that they have the unidentified fingerprints. I called them to Cron the coincidental fingerprints, remember? He said, well, those don't really mean anything. Of course, they had all of the police officers and all of the... Why are they getting the prints of the paramedics if they weren't wandering throughout the house? They had all of the prints of the paramedics, all of the prints of the police officers, all of the prints of the Routier family, and they compared them. No match. And Cron says, well, that doesn't mean anything. And you can imagine what it would mean if her prints were on there. Then it would have been extremely important, like it was when her hair was in the window. But we know about that. Cron didn't have any opinion about that sock. They never asked him about that sock. They preferred to ignore the sock. You talk about artifacts. And you know what an artifact is. An artifact is something that has been changed or a man-made change in the crime scene. That is an artifact. Well, when do you determine whether or not there are any artifacts? And isn't that the first thing? Bill Parker said this, and I think Richard Mosty categorized him perfect as the closer. He is the guy, on the used car lot that comes in when they are balking a little bit and they are trying to make a sale, and he is the closer. And I tell you, if Bill Parker can't get a confession out of somebody, they haven't done anything. And it's as simple as that. But Parker is the one that they should have asked about this because he is the one that has been out to many crime scenes. But Parker said he wasn't asked to give his opinion or reconstruct anything. But I asked him, aren't all crime scenes contaminated? And he said, yes, they are. The police officers come in there and everybody wants to look at the weapon. Everybody wants to get a drink. Everybody wants to use the bathroom. It's chaotic. Especially when you get the first responders and they are paramedics because they are not interested in the crime scene. They are interested in trying to save lives. But the time that you find out what the artifacts are and what has been changed isn't 5 or 6 months later down at the courthouse when you are doing your mock trial routine. It's there. That is your job, Patterson. You talk to the paramedics. You find out what they have done, what they have moved. Now, there is a very telling photograph here, and I will remind you that both Darlie and Darren, in their statements, say that the glass tabletop was down. Darren says it, and you can look at that. I put it in evidence. They didn't. I put her statement in evidence. They didn't. But she says that there was a tabletop and it was down when she first got up and when he came down the stairs and when they first saw the scene. And this is that tabletop. This is the tabletop right here. And Cron criticized the photographs like all of us do because they are not proper, but Cron was right there and didn't do anything to correct the situation when he saw it. He let the photographer go through there and take 300 pictures in the den and in the kitchen before they ever started to process the situation. And that is not good police work. And you know that. Just from sitting here as jurors. Common sense tells you that. But you can tell from this photograph, I guess it goes like this, but you can see that that blood has run off that table. And that is consistent with it being down. Darren told you that the paramedic put that table back on the pedestal. Darren told you that the paramedic knocked that lampshade down. Darren told you and Darlie told you that she used the vacuum cleaner to steady herself on. Now, if that is not the case, we know Waddell and Walling are still here. God only knows what this has cost the county of Dallas, but they can get them here like instant coffee. So they are still here. They could have called Mr. Waddell up here and said, Mr. Waddell, did you ever see her using this vacuum cleaner? We know, Mr. Waddell, that you didn't see it in the kitchen, but did you ever see her using this vacuum cleaner to steady herself with, like she said? And he could have told you one way or the other. And it's absurd for them to suggest that Walling and Waddell were in that kitchen and saw the glass on the floor and didn't see a vacuum cleaner. Remember how they tiptoed around that glass so as not to step on it? And you are telling me that they didn't see a vacuum cleaner? I asked Waddell, I said, was there anything to obstruct you walking from the den to the kitchen sink? And he said no. Well, I meant, would you have to jump over a vacuum cleaner? And he said he didn't see any vacuum cleaner. To suggest that this is staging is absurd. To suggest that she rolled this around to stage what? This is absurd. But you see what they didn't do. What Patterson didn't do and what Walling didn't do and what the officers didn't do was find out from the paramedics at that time, what have you moved? Not wait until sometime later. What else have they tried to mislead you on? Well, it's kind of curious that Waddell, he makes it sound like there wasn't much going on when he got there. Darlie was rather calm. But when I got this report from him, he admits that in his report, he described her as hysterical. Now, I think Waddell, and I don't mean to fault Waddell, I think he was as shocked as any of us, as I would have been. And I don't know how I would have reacted. I may have frozen, just like he did. I don't know. And so I'm not throwing stones at him, but I think what you heard was what he wished he had done. He didn't help those children, and he didn't do anything to help them. And I dare say he didn't give any instructions. And you are privy, you see. You have this advantage. He said that he didn't do any questioning of Darlie after Sergeant Walling got there. Remember? Remember that? Okay. Walling got there at the end. You can hear where he is coming in on the 911 tape. You have listened to that a bunch of times. Waddell is the one who was questioning her on the 911 tape. She is answering Waddell. She is talking to him about fingerprints. She is talking And when she first said something about fingerprints, she said something about he dropped a knife. And the woman says, don't touch anything. They are trained to tell them that because people instinctively do, just like police officers. They handle, everybody wants to touch the gun, everybody wants to see the knife, and they are instructed, don't touch anything. She said, I've already touched the knife. But when they talk about fingerprints, she is talking to Waddell, but she is carrying on 3 conversations, one with Waddell, one with 911 operator, and one with her husband. You can appreciate that. But they didn't know that at the time. The 911 operator thought she was talking to her. And Waddell, I assume, thought whatever, and the husband. So to hopefully clear that up. But at any rate, let's talk a little bit about the sock. Do you really believe that? First of all, if you are going to plant evidence, what is the most important consideration? That the police find it. I mean, it doesn't do any good if the police don't find it. The police have to find it. Do you think that she is so sophisticated that she would have the presence of mind to put just a smidgen of blood on that sock, just a wipe of blood on that sock, and put it 3 houses down the alley and depend on Patterson and his people to find it? I don't think so. I think what she would have been inclined to do, and what someone who wasn't acquainted with crime scenes, maybe you all, 2 months ago, if you are going to plant something like that, it's going to be a sock that is drenched in blood. And you are going to put it at the end of the driveway, where the driveway meets the alley, to show that someone was taking off and kind of show where they were going down the alley. The court says 15 minutes left. Mr. Mulder continues. You are not going to do anything as subtle as a little smear on that sock, down 3 houses, and hope the police find it. Now, I'm going to have to move on, and I'm going to talk fast, and forgive me. I would like to take another 45 minutes or an hour, but I don't have that luxury. Let's talk about Tom Bevel and talk about what he said. He said basically that there are 2 spots, a spot here and a spot here. And you can either believe that the blood was mixed and it was Darlie's blood and Devin's blood, or Darlie's blood and Damon's blood, or Darlie's blood and Damon's blood. Or you can believe, if you choose, you can believe that one spot of the child's blood hit here, and then one spot of her blood hit right on top of it. And then one spot of the other child's blood hit here. And then another spot of her blood hit right on top of it, exactly right on top of it. And the same thing over here. Now, to make the situation work, Mr. Bevel tells you that the only way you can get this, or one way, I guess, that you could get this on there was through. And when you saw the knife back, the knife blade, which is, it has a supply of both of their blood on it, is cast off here when you the one boy. Okay? Is everybody clear on what he is talking about? Now, if in fact that is true, we know that Darlie has to be injured prior to the time that this happens, because it's got to get her blood on that knife blade. So that means that she is either the one who was assaulted first, her throat is cut, she is in the right forearm, in the left chest, and her fingers are cut here, and she is beaten severely with a blunt instrument. All of that happens first, okay? And then the boys are, and that doesn't make a lot of sense, because you have got to get her down that alley with that sock, and none of her blood is outside the house. In fact, it's not outside. It goes to the front door, and it goes to the utility room, and it's in the kitchen and den. Okay? So that is unlikely that she is the first one, that she is going to cut her throat and do all of this stuff to herself and then the children. But you see, the other version is equally ridiculous, because under that scenario, she both boys, then she cuts her throat and inflicts all of these wounds to herself to get her blood on that knife, you see. And then she goes back and the kids. Now, does that make sense? Neither one of these situations actually makes sense. But you see, she has got to load the knife with her blood if these are mixed blood cast-offs, and it won't work either way. I mean, it doesn't make sense either way. They have the responsibility of telling you how this happened, or they have the responsibility of accounting for you why they can't. And they haven't done that. Now, Angie Rickles came down here and testified. You remember her? She is the young lady that lives on Miami, 4 blocks away. She is 2 blocks on the other side of Del Rock Road. And you know, Del Rock runs from Highway 66 to Interstate 30. And it's about 5 minutes between the two. You get on Interstate 30 and you can be in Dallas in 10 minutes, or you can be in Rockwall or through Rockwall in 10 minutes. You get on 60 and you can, but you have got access to 2 highways and they are only 5 minutes apart. She told you this. She said that her husband works nights. And she said that he was working this particular night when she was home with her 15-year-old daughter and her infant baby. And she said that she heard somebody trying to come in through the door. At first, she thought it was her husband because it was 1:30 and he works late nights. And sometimes he comes home for lunch or checks on her because of her condition. She had a stroke earlier. And then she didn't hear the key in the door, and that aroused her suspicion. She went to the door and she looked out and turned on the light, and these 2 men ran off. Do you remember that? She said of course, it scared her, but she didn't call the police like she should have, I suspect. But at any rate, she said about 15 or 20 minutes later, she heard something at the window, and it was somebody trying to get in with a knife or a screwdriver, and she turned out the lights this time, and she saw them run off. She said she told her husband about it immediately when he got home. He called her in-laws and told some people, and they said, "You really ought to report this." And so she finally did. And she said the police came out there and they really weren't interested in it. Now, this is 1:30 to 1:45 or 2 o'clock, I suspect, on June the 6th, some 4 blocks from where this happened. And the FBI agent said that it's important what has happened in the neighborhood. The black car would have been important. This would have been important. People on the prowl, people walking around, people trying to break into a lady's house, and her situation was similar in that, there was no car in the driveway. Her husband had taken the car to work. The TV was on, evidence that somebody was there, and the house was occupied. The lady of the house was home, there alone. I went out to see her. I filed a motion and got that information from the state in November. And I went out to see her the very next day, just as soon as I could get out there, because I thought it was important. I got out there and I talked to her. And you know what she told me? Mr. Davis says, I'm going to object to whatever she told him out there. That is outside. Mr. Mulder then continues, she testified to the same thing here in court. She said that Mr. Basillo had been out there the day before, and you remember I had looked around for him. I walked out here and I looked for him to see where he was, and he wasn't anywhere to be found in court. And then there was the lady with the blonde hair, she said was also with him. Remember that? I looked around for one of them and couldn't find them. What did he tell her? They said, don't talk to anybody. Now that is not fair play. Patterson ignores everything, and he says, don't talk to anybody. Now, I am offended by the arrogance of that. If this trial is to be a quest, if this trial is to be a search for the truth, then I trust you to hear everything that went on. And that is not fair play, is it? What else has happened? The funny business, like this. Well, we have Wade that walked down the alley, and he said he saw the knife and the screwdriver in the yard back there, and they brought the young man that may not have anything to do with it. But if that is his type of thinking, I mean, if he ignores obvious things like that, what else has he ignored? What else has he ignored? What else was there besides the sock down in that alley that you ought to have access to? I called Darlie Routier to the stand because I thought you had a right to hear her account. It's as simple as that. And not because I had to, and not because it was necessary. I don't think with the state of evidence the way it was at the time that it was. But you have a right to sift through this and hear everything if this is to be a search for what the truth actually is. And that is the way that I look at it. Apparently, not the way they look at it, because they have not done what they said they were going to do. What about this amnesia? Is that something that I dreamed up? No, it's not. Lisa Clayton told you about amnesia. Lisa Clayton told you that she had studied under Resnick, who is the leading authority on why mothers kill babies or children. And she outlined for you the reasons. And I don't have time to go through all of those reasons, but we went through each one carefully because I think it's important to you. And she told you why each one was not applicable to this particular case, didn't she? And she said, Mulder, when I got into this case, the only restriction that I put on it was that I was going to tell the truth. And I said, that is fair with me. That's all I want. Okay? And she told you that she believed Darlie Routier. She talked to her family. She talked to her husband. She talked to her in-laws. She said, I believed her. She is not guilty. Do they rebut that? These folks have the luxury of having 10 grand for this guy to come in here and do this song and dance on this 911 tape. They can spend 10,000 for that. They can bring you a psychiatrist. If what Lisa Clayton said is not true, Dr. Vincent DeMaio, 28 years as a pathologist. I suggest to you that there is no one better qualified in the United States. And he happens to be in Bexar County. And I didn't hire him for this case. I know the man naturally, but I didn't hire him for this case. But I submit to you that there is no one better qualified. 7,000 autopsies, supervised 21,000 autopsies, has been doing this 28 years. And he tells you under oath, these wounds are not consistent with being self-inflicted. They simply are not. Now, their doctor wouldn't commit herself, and I don't blame her, but she would not commit. Do they have unlimited funds? And if what Dr. DeMaio is telling you is not true, they could bring someone in here, and I suspect maybe they already have. I don't know. The court says, 5 minutes left, Mr. Mulder. Mr. Mulder continues, yes, sir. But I suspect that if that were not the gospel truth, they would bring someone in here. Dr. DeMaio told you that he has been involved in cases where people who have self-inflicted the wounds and injuries were medical people. In fact, he told you about 2 months ago or so that he testified it was a nurse. He said they use their dominant hand because that is natural to them. The medical people do it. Why would I think that she would be so sophisticated enough to think on down the line to a jury and use one hand to do this and another hand to do this? I mean, why would she do that? It makes absolutely no sense. They have indicted her on 2 offenses here. This is the first of the trials. Refused to try them together. You, as jurors, have the awesome duty and responsibility to determine what the facts are, the credibility of the witnesses, and the weight that you want to assign the testimony of those witnesses. Like I said, this clock is about to choke me off, and I would like to talk to you a little bit longer, but I have got something I want to say. Look at how long it would have taken for her to do this. And we have got to have a place that we can kind of start. And let's start with that 911 tape that goes in at 2:31. Okay? The tape is 5 minutes and 44 seconds long. So that takes us up to nearly 237 or 236:44 if we were right on the money when we started at 231. It takes us up to 236:44 when Walling gets there. Remember? He gets there at the end of the tape. What does Walling say? Do the paramedics come in immediately? No. He said, I had to secure the place before the paramedics were in. And he said, we secured the place. You remember because up until then, according to Darren, Waddell had never drawn his gun. He went into the kitchen a little bit, but he had never drawn his gun. And Walling came in, and he and Waddell secured the area. And then they got the paramedics in, and the paramedics came in. So let's give them a minute to secure the area. And that gets us to 237:44. He said they rushed in, and Colby was the first one to get to Damon. Remember, he said he saw that he administered whatever aid he could to him, and he saw the light of life leave his eye. Remember when he said that? Now, let's give him 30 seconds to do that. So it's now 2:38. Dr. Townsend told you that that youngster would have hung in there for a matter of minutes. And when I tried to pin her down, it was finally 5 or 6 minutes. And then she said it could have been as many as 8 or 9 minutes. Okay? If you dial that back from the 2:37, 9 minutes, then you are at 2:29 when that youngster is, and she then has to cut her throat. She has got to get that sock down the alley. She has got to cut her throat. She has got to do all of this staging. She has got to break the glass. Remember, some of the glass had blood on it and some of the glass didn't have blood on it. And then there was glass shards up on the shelf and glass in the ice bucket. She didn't throw it down. That was broken as the assailant went out of there. You can tell from the physical evidence that is not part of staging. Dr. Coons tells you, and with this, I think I am about out of soap. But Dr. Coons tells you this. He has done a lot of research on memory, and Mr. Mosty talked to him back in December and then called him the other night, late at night, and told him that he was due in court here, and he came in. And he told you about memory. And he said the mind is not like a camera. And when the mind experiences an overwhelmingly traumatic event, it's like the circuit breaker in your electrical circuit, and it flips or it blows a fuse. It shuts down. You see, the trauma that the mind can't handle. He said it's like the woman who is in a car accident and her child is, and she doesn't remember anything about the accident, but she can tell you in detail what happened in the ambulance on the way to the hospital because she has a memory of that. It's really the mind shuts down. It's like walking into a movie in the middle. And what she told these people from time to time, and I dare say the mind, she knew that she was fighting. She knew that she was involved in a struggle. You can't be beat up like that. They want you to think that somebody beat her up when she got out of the hospital. It's ludicrous. I had that little Polaroid picture that shows where the bruising is started on her arm. That is ludicrous. The court says, Mr. Mulder, your time is up. If you could close briefly, please. Mr. Mulder continues. Yes, sir. I have done all I can. You have been most attentive. I have watched you. You have been most attentive. You have paid attention, and you have listened to the witnesses. This lady is simply not guilty. There is a reasonable doubt. I'll ask you to find her not guilty. And I thank you for your time and for your attention. Thank you, Judge. The court says, thank you, Mr. Mulder. The jury have been in the courtroom for some time. We'll take a 10-minute break, and we mean 10 minutes, please. You can step outside briefly. Thank you. So at this point, what happens is that the jury takes their 10-minute break, and they come back into the courtroom, and the court says the following. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the defense has requested an additional 5 minutes to make one more point. I'm going to grant that request with the understanding that Mr. Davis will also have an additional 5 minutes in his summation, Mr. Mosty. And so Mr. Richard Mosty of the defense gets up to have his 5 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, I have to be a little sheepish as I come up here and say that there is something that we didn't cover. And as Mr. Mulder would say, just a thing or two, but it is going to be just a thing or two. And I want to pick up with this timeline that Mr. Mulder started on and lay into that. You know, that from the end of the 911 tape at 2:37 or 2:36:44, let me call it 2:37, there is another minute or so after that to 2:38 that before the paramedics are in, there's some period of time after that in the 2:38 or the 2:39 range when Damon is said to be. So that leaves that 8 to 9 minutes of a window from 2:29 or 2:28 to 2:39 before Damon is. And what I want to lay for you is what has to happen there. And I'm going to describe some of these things. Now, for the state's theory to be true, now you know that Mrs. Routier is not any children by the time the 2:31 call comes in. That is when she is on the 911 and her husband is almost immediately heard on the tape within 30 seconds. I believe it's maybe 38 seconds. So you know that all of this has to happen then in a 2 or maybe 3 minute span. And here is what has to happen. Mrs. Routier has to the children 2 times, each of them multiple times in all of this. And what the state has described as, how could anyone sleep through it? And then she has to get a smidgen of blood off of each, not one, off each. And then she has to go out the window and she has got to run around behind on Eagle Drive. Now, you know that if somebody is going to do that, they aren't just going to bolt down these 3 houses. They are going to have to come around and look in the alley. Now, she has got to go out of the gate. That is so hard to kick, but she had to kick it. I guess she kicked it barefooted. She has to have the sock in her hand and not leave any blood on the gate. She has to kick it barefooted. She has to run down the alley, all the way down there, 3 houses down, more than 75 yards, you know, an Olympic sprinter type. And then she has to come back, and then she has to come back in the house. She hasn't been wounded at this time. Now, I'm saying, I'm giving the screen, I'm not even putting this in any part of this. She has to come back in the house, and get the knife again. Now, we know that the knife has not been laid down on the carpet because she is not wounded. So she has to then take that knife and she has to cut herself 5 times somewhere. And then she has got to be bleeding profusely by that time, sometime. Now, at some point, she has got to go over and lay the knife down carefully, by there. Wait a minute, I forgot something. You have got this maroon pillow in evidence. You know about blood spatter now. You see this blood? You see that blood run? That is Mrs. Routier's blood. She has to lay down on the pillow at some point, bleed and let that run down. Maybe she cut her knife on the pillow. She has to do that. Now she has got to lay a blood trail. She has got to lay lots of blood trails. She has got to lay one to the utility room. Slowly, the state says, slowly lay a blood trail to the utility room. And then she has got to come back. Now she has got to go to the sink and she has got to lay a lot of blood. She has got to lay a lot of blood. She has got to go over to the children. She has got to lay blood over by the children because we know those blood drops are there. She has to knock off the coffee table slightly askew. She has got to do all of that because there is blood there. She has got to knock down the lamp. What else does she have to do? She is running. No, no, she is not running. She is walking. She is walking through the house doing this because the blood is slow. The state told you that. She has got to pick up the knife off of the carpet. She has got to pick up the knife off of the carpet. She has got to lay more blood trails. She has got to get the vacuum. I guess she puts the knife up there. Then she has got to get the vacuum cleaner. She has got to do it 3 times. How many times? 3. Up, down, and then she has got to throw it over. Then she has got to stand over it so she could bleed on it. The court says, "You have 1 minute left, Mr. Mosty, please." Mr. Mosty continues. And all of that, that is what she has got to do in all of this time frame. And quite frankly, wait, she cut her shirt. Don't you remember? She cut her shirt somewhere in there. Now, with all of that, in all of that, those are the things that Dr. DeMaio says are usual in a statement. And all of that, what she has had. And this is after Dr. Coons has described that traumatic event where she wouldn't have any memory. And all of this has to happen in about 2 minutes. Thank you. The court says, "Thank you, Mr. Mosty." And then at this point, the prosecution gets to make another argument, and they are given 45 minutes. Actually, I think it's going to be 50 minutes because the previous one got an extra, or the defense got an extra 5 minutes. So we are going to pause at this point and then pick up in the next episode. All right, everybody, let's recap really quick what we've heard. And let's just start kind of from the beginning. I'm going to go through this pretty fast. First of all, Mulder gives his argument to the jury. One of the, I think, more compelling statements that Mulder made was the fact that the prosecution never called the lead detective in the case, that the defense actually had to do it. He also talks about a call coming into the Rowlett Police Department about a man in a black cap, but nothing was really done about this. Mulder said that this call had come in the next morning about a man in a black cap by someone who lived just a little ways away from the Routiers. And at this point, Davis, the prosecutor, he objects and he's like, "Hey, it wasn't in the morning, but it was in the afternoon." And the judge says to the jury, "Hey, just remember that the testimony as you recall it." However, when I went back and I looked, it was in fact the next morning and not the afternoon, at least according to the transcripts. The fingerprints had not been checked out that were found in the window. The black car and the reports of this black car were not investigated, even though many people told the police about it. Even Patterson, the lead detective on the case, was told about it. And he also makes another great point that, the state has plenty of funds. They have plenty of attorneys, plenty of investigators, and they're all at their disposal to call in as many people as they want to prove their case. But they could find no one to speak about Darlie as a bad mother. So let's go back to the fingerprints. So these fingerprints on the windowsill of the garage, Mulder said that these prints were compared to the prints of the officers, the paramedics, and the Routier family, and none of them matched. He then talks about the sock never being mentioned when Cron was on the stand, which was interesting. I found that interesting. He then continues to talk about the officers at the scene, Waddell and Walling, and how they had spoken about stepping over the glass that was on the floor in the kitchen, but they never once mentioned a vacuum cleaner in the kitchen. So the fact that they noticed glass and not a vacuum cleaner is kind of what he's trying to point out here. He also explains that when Waddell testified, he told the jury that Darlie was rather calm when he arrived. However, in his report, it says that she is hysterical. He talks about the sock again, and how if someone wanted to create an artifact or lead the police in one direction, that the sock would have been much closer to the house, even in the driveway. And instead of having just tiny little dots of blood on them, it would have been drenched in blood. Then there's the neighbor who was just blocks from the Routiers, who had an attempted break in at her home while her husband was at work. And how once she did report it, nothing was done. That the state had sent their investigator out there to this woman's home and told this woman to not speak to anyone. The defense wasn't able to talk to her until the following day after the state had already been there. And even then, the defense had to file a motion just to get this information from the state. He then goes over the testimonies of Darlie's psychiatrist and Dr. DeMaio, who talks about Darlie's wounds not being self-inflicted. And then we hear quite a bit of the different timelines of how Darlie could have pulled this off. And I won't go into detail here, but in the show notes are chapters where you can find any particular section that you are looking for to easily get to it and listen to it if you'd like to. And that will do it for now. Thank you all for listening. If you haven't yet subscribed to the show or the channel on YouTube, please consider doing so. It doesn't cost you anything at all, and you'll be the first person to know when new episodes are released. So thanks again, everyone. We'll talk very soon. Bye for now.